To what extent do you trust your government? Do you think your government would lie to you? Have they ever lied to you? And if so, why? In our episode, How Consumer Propaganda Changed America, we were introduced to Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. He had created a new kind of firm in America, one that specialized in propaganda campaigns meant to motivate consumers into buying more and more of the things they didn't need. This marked the birth of a new American industry. It would be called public relations. Unlike his clients, who included businessmen, celebrities, and notable politicians, Bernays himself was not motivated by fortune, fame, or even political office. What Bernays wanted was a peaceful, prospering American democracy. And in order to have that, Bernays believed that the masses needed to be controlled by an intelligent minority. This story is about the fight for America's consciousness that broke out in the early 30s between America's politicians and its corporations. In its aftermath, Edward Bernays would unite America around irrational fears. Fears that Bernays felt, if nurtured, would be strong enough to dissuade Americans from the facts in front of them, as the corporations, the president, and the CIA would all band together to feed the American public lies. In 1924, the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, hired Bernays to help with his public image because Americans thought Coolidge was super boring. To make the president feel more relatable and hip, Bernays organized a pancake breakfast at the White House for Coolidge and a group of famous actors and actresses. The event was widely publicized, and Bernays continued to work for Coolidge as he secured his second term in office. Coolidge was now widely seen as a popular and successful president, and in no small part thanks to America's booming economy. Like Bernays, Coolidge was a strong supporter of laissez-faire capitalism and believed government intervention in the economy would only lead to inefficiencies. As a result of his laissez-faire beliefs, Coolidge signed deregulation laws that allowed banks to make risky investments. He also cut taxes for the wealthy, which led to a growing gap between the rich and the poor. To inspire optimism amongst America's working-class citizens, Bernays convinced the masses to begin investing in America's booming stock market. He distributed propaganda that argued owning a piece of the stock market was the key to the American dream, which resulted in a wave of stock purchases from banks who also happened to be Bernays' clients. America's stock market continued soaring, but its unsustainable growth had disillusioned business owners, bankers, and politicians who had all convinced themselves recessions were now a thing of the past. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the Great Depression happened. Coolidge's policies led to a significant oversight in America's banking system, and the emotion-driven purchasing of stocks by retail investors, instigated by Bernays, had only exacerbated the extent to which these stocks were overvalued. But it also ensured that some of the biggest losers during the Great Depression would be working-class Americans, who until then were convinced that they had been investing in the American dream. A wave of panic selling had erased half the value of the stock market, and a quarter of America's workforce was now unemployed. So what did President Coolidge do to fix this mess? Well, nothing, because he had actually left office right before the Great Depression had started, and the new president, Herbert Hoover, had no idea how he was going to calm down the furious American voters. And so, like his predecessor, he hired Bernays. Bernays worked to create positive stories about Hoover in the media, but he also helped coordinate Hoover's response to the Great Depression. Bernays believed that the most important interests at hand were not that of the American citizens, but that of the American corporations that made America rich, efficient, and plentiful. Bernays persuaded President Hoover to create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Federal Farm Board, government organizations that would provide loans to banks, businesses, and farmers, many of whom just happened to be Bernays' clients. Despite Bernays' guidance, Hoover's response to the Great Depression was unsatisfactory, and Americans soon became convinced that Hoover was an ineffective. As the attention of the American public grew, Franklin D. Roosevelt emerged as the leader of the Democratic Party. Roosevelt advocated for a new approach to government, one that was more active and interventionist. He promised to help American people through the Depression and won the 1932 election in a landslide.
Soon after taking office, Roosevelt made it clear that he would be president of all the people, including those at the bottom of the economic ladder.
In the working out of a great national program that seeks the primary good of the greater number, it is true that the toes of some people are being stepped on and are going to be stepped on. But these toes belong to the comparative few who seek to retain or to gain position or riches or both by some shortcut that is harmful to the greater good.
Bernays didn't like this, as he and FDR had ideologically opposing views on people and the future of American democracy. Bernays believed that the judgment of the masses couldn't be trusted. The average man doesn't know what's right for the country, the economy, or even themselves, and that for a democracy to function effectively, the people must believe they are entrusted with power and freedom, but in reality, be guided by more aware leaders who could mold the desires of the public to align with a clear vision for the future. As Bernays cynically stated in 1928, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. Unlike Bernays, FDR believed human beings were rational, and that the public could in fact be trusted to take an active part in government. He believed that it was possible to explain his policies to ordinary Americans and take their sentiments into account. To do this, he was going to use a new American invention called scientific polling, and its purpose was to offer a clearer, more objective way of understanding and documenting the collective consciousness of America. Their system of opinion polling was based on two assumptions. The first was that the public could be trusted to provide answers that were both genuine and useful. The second is that the government could be trusted to use the polls as a method for understanding Americans as opposed to persuading them. In the wake of this new polling methodology, the presidential approval rating was born, and whether it was due to the polling methodology, the government's role in institutionalizing this poll, or FDR's genuine popularity, the newly conceived presidential approval rating would go on to reaffirm a clear message. America loved FDR's New Deal. FDR's first New Deal focused on providing relief to the unemployed and stimulating the economy. He became incredibly popular for looking after the average American and began advertising the policies of his second New Deal ahead of his re-election campaign.
Name, please.
Still Franklin Deeds. All right.
President Roosevelt was cheery as ever when he went into the booth to record his own vote, and a few hours afterwards his optimism was justified. Broadway went mad as the former president was returned again with the biggest majority ever known in American politics.
FDR promised that his second New Deal would establish larger social welfare safety nets, protect the rights of workers to bargain collectively, and it would establish minimum wages and maximum work hours. This all sounded like a nightmare for America's corporate elite, who believed that Roosevelt was nothing short of a dictator. The leaders of America's largest industries did all they could to lobby against FDR and spent millions of dollars to try and bring his presidency to an end. America's industries felt that they had to fight back and hired Bernays to deploy large-scale ideological warfare against the values of the New Deal. Bernays created the National Association of Manufacturers, a lobby group that still exists to this day. The group's members included all the major corporations of the United States, who provided Bernays with the resources to launch propaganda campaigns explicitly designed to create emotional attachments between the public and big business. Bernays crafted a narrative that suggested it was the enterprises, not politicians, who had sculpted modern America. Bernays went on to plant articles in leading journals like the Wall Street Journal, which sharply criticized the New Deal as a threat to free enterprise and individual liberty. In 1936, the National Association of Manufacturing introduced the American Plan, an alternative anti-New Deal proposal which Bernays aggressively marketed across the country. Bernays even infiltrated Hollywood studios, persuading film producers and newsreels that there were greater profits to be made by casting the New Deal in a negative light. Films like MGM's Gabriel Over the White House and Warner Brothers' Black Legion portrayed FDR as a power-hungry autocrat who threatened American democracy.
The President of the United States.
May the rules be suspended? I would like to dispense with all red tape so I can answer questions directly while I have the floor.
Mr. President, there is a movement in Congress for your impeachment. Hardly the time for making any requests, however small.
Very well. I shall withdraw that request, but I would like to substitute another. I ask you, gentlemen, to declare a state of national emergency and to adjourn this Congress until normal conditions are restored. During the period of that adjournment, I shall assume full responsibility for the government. I believe in democracy, as Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln believed in democracy. And if what I plan to do in the name of the people makes me a dictator, then it is a dictatorship based on Jefferson's definition of democracy.
In response to these campaigns, FDR made films of his own. Films that warned the ordinary American of the underhanded tactics big business used to manipulate them. And the central villain was not the CEOs of the companies, but the public relations consultants themselves.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes, corrupting and deceiving the public. The aims of such groups may be either good or bad, so far as the public interest is concerned, but their methods are a grave danger to democratic institutions.
On 3 different occasions, Bernays got a call from the US president asking for help, and now the office of the US president was turning against him. Bernays viewed this new emerging political landscape with skepticism. He viewed FDR's interventionist approach to government and faith in the rationality of the public as a direct challenge to the belief system that was responsible for America's success. This ideological rift set the stage for the 1939 New York World's Fair. The fair was originally intended to celebrate scientific discoveries, but as one of the chief organizers of the fair, Bernays was adamant that the fair needed to be used to reinvigorate an appetite for the American dream. In his own words, "There's a growing misunderstanding and ignorance amongst Americans as to who America is. Disorders, strikes, disagreements, cleavages of all kinds grow out of this lack of understanding of common interests and common goals. The World's Fair, celebrating 150 years of American progress, must be both a landing stage and a springboard." Bernays would base the fair off a vision of a sleek modern future filled with exciting new electronic products like the television. The fair's slogan was "Dawn of a New Day," and it invited everyone to come visit the world of tomorrow. Bernays designed a giant exhibition he called Democracy. Its main attraction was a giant white dome symbolizing a future harmonized by capitalism and democracy. In attendance was President FDR.
I hereby dedicate the World's Fair, the New York World's Fair of 1939, and I declare it open to all mankind.
He opened the fair with an enthusiastic speech, but no one seemed to remember it. Everyone was instead too enamored by the shiny promise of future prosperity the fair had ushered in. The fair was a tremendous success and drew in over 44 million visitors. The success of the fair greatly revitalized the reputation of the public relations industry, which had been undermined by the Great Depression and New Deal eras. Bernays' success had caught the eye of his next client, and this client would be the pinnacle of Bernays' career and provide an opportunity for Bernays to once again work with the President of the United States to disseminate propaganda intended to strengthen America's democracy. Following a surge in global coffee demand in the late 19th century, the Guatemalan government dispossessed the indigenous population of their land and allowed foreign companies to purchase it. Two of the largest landowners then merged into the United Fruit Company. By the year 1900, it had become the largest exporter of bananas in the world and had a monopoly over the Guatemalan banana trade. But in addition to selling lots of bananas, United Fruit also ruled over Guatemala. Governing through proxy dictatorships, United Fruit controlled the railroads, docks, and communication systems of the country at the expense of the Guatemalan citizens in order to protect and control the lucrative banana trade. It was known as a banana republic. After the World Fair, United Fruit hired Bernays to promote banana sales within the United States, which he did by linking bananas to good health. However, Bernays warned that United Fruit's oppressive tactics over the Guatemalan people, a key element in their banana empire, risked igniting public outrage in America. Bernays knew that if the American public learned about the harsh realities of corporate colonization and the dire working conditions behind their beloved bananas, this would be disastrous for the company and the spread of capitalist values. To ensure control over Guatemala's workforce, the United Fruit Company had been pitting racial groups against one another for decades. American whites would be given the most prestigious jobs like managers and financial advisors, while people of color worked hard labor. The company made a rigid distinction between Hispanics and West Indian workers and administered different privileges and punishments to each ethnic group. If one group was rewarded, management told them it was because they worked harder than the other group. If a punishment was administered, management told them it was the other group's fault. This would give the two groups something to focus their anger on, rather than unite against United Fruit. To control the narrative in America, United Fruit permitted Bernays to create a front group called the Middle America Information Bureau, which supplied information to journalists and academics back in America. Middle America was Bernays' attempt to rebrand Central America and reintroduce it to the American public as a neighboring land that could and should grow into democratic American values. Led by Bernays, the organization spun events in Central America through the filter of United Fruit's economic and political goals, providing American journalists and opinion leaders with United Fruit's approved context. For example, in the run-up to the 1945 Guatemalan Revolution, the Middle America Information Bureau published a pamphlet titled, "Every American has a personal stake in our relations with Middle America," citing quotes from military leaders, business executives, and government officials explaining the interdependence of Middle America and the United States. But by 1948, United Fruit shut down the Middle America Information Bureau, as Thomas Dudley Cabot, United Fruit's new president, thought it was a useless waste of money and terminated the entire thing before leaving United Fruit himself the very next year. Bernays was furious, but stayed with the company for an annual fee of more than $100,000, about $1.3 million in today's terms. As Guatemala's revolution raged on, a young colonel named Jacobo Arbenz announced he would run for president under a promise to take control over the country's resources and get rid of United Fruit. It was a massively popular move, but an absolute nightmare for United Fruit. In 1953, President Arbenz began taking Guatemala's land by force, motivating United Fruit to turn towards Bernays for an unorthodox solution. And then, a bomb went off in Russia. In 1953, the Soviet Union announced that the United States no longer had a monopoly on the hydrogen bomb. The fear of nuclear war and communism gripped the United States, and the government was trying to tell the people to calm down. President Eisenhower called upon Bernays for consultation, and the two had a secret meeting.
It's the fallacy of devoting 85% of one's worrying capacity to an agent that constitutes only about 15% of an atomic bomb's destroying potential.
Bernays said rather than reduce the fear of communism, the president should actually encourage and manipulate people's fear in order to weaponize it, by controlling the narrative in such a manner that the rational arguments became irrelevant. The U.S. would be able to more effectively unite America around a shared mission, saving America. And so to achieve this, they were going to create a fictitious narrative in which America and the American way of life were in danger. And Bernays was going to use Guatemala as a central villain in this grand exaggeration. The plan was to frame Guatemala's president as a communist who was controlled by Moscow and devoted to bringing an end to American liberties. But in reality, Arbenz had no relation to Moscow at all and wasn't even familiar with communist literature. He was a democratically elected president who was now going to see Bernays and the U.S. government rewrite Guatemala's history. President Eisenhower secretly agreed that it was America's interest to topple the Arbenz government, and so the CIA was instructed to pull off a coup using propaganda and psychological warfare to ensure that the defeat of the Guatemalans was inevitable. The man in charge of the coup was a man named Howard Hunt, one of Nixon's Watergate burglars.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II, and just rendered everybody paralyzed.
Working with the United Fruit Company, the CIA trained a rebel army from Honduras and found a new leader for Guatemala, Colonel Armas. Meanwhile, Bernays was working to evolve the public perception of Guatemala. Bernays invited a cohort of journalists from various notable newspapers on a tour of Guatemala. They knew very little of the country or its politics, but Bernays arranged for the journalists to meet a select group of Guatemalan politicians, all of whom confirmed that Arbenz was indeed a communist controlled by Moscow. This technique proved highly effective and was repeated 4 more times. During one visit, a violent anti-American demonstration broke out, but those who worked for United Fruit suspected that Bernays had staged the entire thing. The CIA was now ready to invade Guatemala, but the American public was fed a starkly different narrative. Following Bernays' meeting with President Eisenhower, major publications like the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, Time, Newsweek, and the Atlantic Monthly began disseminating articles. These pieces painted a picture of a looming communist threat in America's backyard. In June 1954, the CIA initiated the coup. It was called Operation PBS Success. The CIA supported a military faction led by Carlos Armas and coupled this with a psychological warfare campaign designed to convince Guatemalans of their inevitable defeat. Bernays played a crucial role here, becoming the main information source for major news writers like the Associated Press, United Press International, and the International News Service. These global agencies provided the foundational facts and imagery that other publications around the world used to shape their narratives, and rather have actual primary sources to draw from, they had Bernays. The CIA went as far as to evoke nerve wars on individuals. Their campaign entailed spreading fear and paranoia among Guatemalan political figures via the mail, sending out death threats, small wooden coffins, dummy bombs, and hangman nooses, all targeted to those loyal to the government. A pivotal element of the psychological warfare was the Voice of Liberation, a radio station that broadcasted anti-communist propaganda, urging resistance against the Arbenz government and support for Castillo Armas. While it claimed to operate from within the Guatemalan jungles, it was actually based in Miami. Meanwhile, the U.S. Information Agency was disseminating hundreds of articles based on CIA reports across the whole of Latin America, reinforcing the U.S. viewpoint. The CIA even convinced allied governments to showcase video footage to its people that casted the events in Guatemala in a light favorable to the U.S. narrative. Per Bernays' strategy, United Fruit distributed favorable articles and anonymous reports on Guatemala to every member of Congress, informing them that Moscow intended to use Guatemala as a base where it would launch an attack against the U.S.
In Guatemala, the Jacob Arbenz regime became increasingly communistic after its inauguration in 1951. Communists in the Congress and high governmental positions controlled major committees, labor and farm groups, and propaganda facilities. They agitated and led in demonstrations against neighboring countries and the United States.
The CIA wished to make an example of Guatemala, so neighboring host nations, heavily controlled by American corporations, would be deterred from ever uprising. The CIA paid off the Guatemalan military so that the militia group that they had sourced from Honduras would win. After the victory, Carlos Castillo Armas was appointed as president of Guatemala, where he served as a puppet of United Fruit Company for the rest of his term. He returned all of the confiscated land to United Fruit and gave them preferential treatment over Guatemala's ports and railways. The company continued to influence the media of North and Central America to justify what they had done. They called Armas the Liberator and told the inspiring tale of how he freed Guatemala from its communist ties. They also destroyed what was left of Arbenz's reputation by calling him Red Jacobo, further tying him to the Soviets. A New York Times article written in 1954 states that President Castillo Armas is continuing to act with the moderation and common sense, and Jacobo Arbenz, anyway, is a defeated balloon, hardly likely to cause any more trouble. The media praised Armas for his good policy making, yet most of his policies were proposed by United Fruit or the American government. Colonel Arbenz fled the country, and within months, Vice President Nixon visited Guatemala to see what a fantastic job Bernays, Castillo, and the CIA had done. In a final display of propaganda by the United States PR department, Nixon was presented with piles of Marxist literature that America had planted in Arbenz's office and bedroom. The Americans, thanks to the help of Bernays, had successfully lied to everyone. Guys,
this is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people. And for that, we congratulate you and the people of Guatemala for the support they have given. And we are sure that under your leadership, supported by the people whom I have met by the hundreds on my visit to Guatemala, that Guatemala is going to enter a new era in which there will be prosperity for the people together with liberty for the people. Thank you very much for allowing us to see this exhibit of communism in Guatemala.
I have some exciting news, some very, very exciting news. Can you tell that I'm excited? The team over at Economics Explained is launching a new channel. It's called Context Matters, and it's done in collaboration with the Red Line podcast. Great podcast, by the way, if you haven't checked it out. And what I'm perhaps most excited about is this new channel is dedicated to politics. And we have some amazing videos out there for the launch. So go check it out. Share it with all your politics junkies. Link is in bio. I'm going to be binging it. In fact, I'm going to go binge it right now. I'm probably going to start with the North Korea episode. That looked like a good episode. But then again, a U.S. dictator episode, that also looks like a pretty good episode. Go check it out. Context matters. I will see you guys next time.